Today, my wife and I are visiting Colonial Williamsburg, an amazing living history museum in Virginia that tells the early part of America's enduring story. Come along with me and my wife as we explore a history buff's paradise. That's coming up next.
Good afternoon, gentlemen, ladies. Good people are United States of America. The instance for a new election of a citizen to administer our executive branch of government being not far removed, I thought at this time it proper that I apprise you of a decision that I have reached, not without some mature reflection. And that is that my name shall not be amongst the number from whom your choice shall be made. I have long hoped that I might be allowed to return to that peaceable retirement from which I have been so reluctantly drawn. But the confused and perplexed state of our affairs, both domestic and abroad, have caused me to forego my own personal preferences. Stepping away as I now do from the public stage, I cannot fail but to look with gratitude upon the many honors that you have placed upon my brow, and the continuing support that you as a people have given me. We are taught by the ancients that there is no greater honor that any man may hope to achieve than recognition by his neighbors and virtuous countrymen for service to his nation. And so for that recognition, I'm certainly grateful. Perhaps here I ought to stop. But my continuing concern for your happiness and felicity as a people causes me to wish to share with you certain opinions that I have come to. Remarks which I hope will be received by you, not as coming from the President of these United States, but rather simply the words of a departing friend, who cannot hope for any personal gain by having shared them with you. In these last several years, we've all been made witnesses of a most novel and astonishing of spectacles. And we have all grown a great affection for the union of our states, and so it should be. For a country which gives you the protection of your rights and liberties, that nation has the right to concentrate your affections. There is no greater honor that may be bestowed upon you than your national capacity than your title of American, which is your title in that capacity. A title which bestows the truly patriotic heart, far more than any honors which may be given by mere regional distinctions. The differences betwixt us are small. And rather than embracing those differences, we should instead embrace those matters that bind us together as one. It is an outside threat that first drove us into our Confederation. But it shall always be upon our Confederation that our safety and our importance depends. 16 states, all pulling against one another, and every one of them tugging against the federal head will certainly bring upon us our ruin. That is as clear to me as ever was the sun in its meridian brightness. Whereas a wise and liberal constitution, closely watched and guarded to prevent encroachment, that gives us every reason to suppose that we might obtain that level of dignity and respect that we had every promise of achieving. Again, in these last several years, we've all been made witnesses of the most novel and astonishing of spectacles, of an entire people gathered together peaceably to determine for themselves under what form of government they believe they will live most happy. The people of our United States have deliberated, and with mature consideration have created a new written constitution far superior to its predecessor. One that provides for a balance of its powers and allows for its own amendment. In truth, it may well be said that the most important of all of our political principles and customs is this ability to amend our systems of government. But let us always remember that just as with any other human institution, that time and experience are just as necessary to determine the usefulness of governments and constitutions. Let us never enter into alteration or change simply for the want of innovation or novelty. Likewise, before such alteration is made by the will of the people as a whole, by those means provided for within the fifth article, let us always remember that that Constitution is the rule and guide of our land, and must therefore be given all due respect and dignity. There is no more power granted unto our general government than that which is absolutely necessary, the business of good government. These powers are divided twixt a legislative, executive, and judicial branch, in such fashion that there may never rise an aristocracy, a monarchy, an oligarchy, or any other form of despotic or tyrannic government, provided there remains virtue within the breast of our people. For by way of this Constitution, the sovereignty of this nation shall always reside within its people. Let us never allow any branch of our government to encroach upon the powers of the other two. For such encroachment tends to concentrate all the powers of government into just a few hands, and it is a true form of despotism. But there may well arise some occasion where such encroachment appears to give some temporary benefit, or perhaps to increase our national security. But we must always be mindful that it is by encroachment that one finds the usual means by which free governments are destroyed. Therefore, it is far better that such thing be avoided, to not concentrate those powers. As it is a pillar of our strength and our security, let us always endeavor to preserve public credit. One of the best means by which public credit may be preserved is to avoid spending it unnecessarily. Remembering always that timely disbursements to provide for a nation's defense are oftentimes more affordable than those occasions of necessary war when they arise without such preparation. And when we find ourselves in those circumstances of necessary war, let us recall that the debts caused by such actions must be paid. And never left ungenerously to be paid by our children or our children's children, which ought to have been paid by ourselves. Now, this last maxim is, of course, the responsibility of our representatives within the legislature. But public opinion has a portion to which it must play, which is simply this: that for debt to be paid, there must be revenue. And for there to be revenue, there must be taxes. And there have never been taxes created which are not inconvenient and unpleasant. A moment ago I mentioned that we should endeavor to avoid seeing factions arise by regional distinction. But it is just as important that we endeavor to avoid seeing factions arise by the alternating domination of one political party over another, spurred on by the spirit of revenge. Oh, I am full aware that some of you may make the argument that this tendency towards political party, that it is necessary to keep a government free. And that may be true in those governments of a more monarchical cast. But in any truly free government such as our own, there will always be enough difference of opinion for any useful purpose without the creation of political parties. Likewise, I'm aware that some of you may make the argument that this tendency towards factions in general, that it's simply a portion of our human natures. And I don't disagree. But have we not in other matters endeavored to improve upon the way that nature finds us? To guide ourselves not by our irregular passions and desires, but rather instead by reason and conscience? So too must we learn to circumscribe our tendency towards political faction. Political faction causes a man not to be a servant to his nation, but nothing more than a servant to a political party. And it is a very dangerous fire, which if allowed to smolder unwatched, will soon consume everything before it. We find ourselves in a most remarkable circumstances. And we should always endeavor to allow our affairs of state to be guided not by affection or hatred for a foreign nation, but rather by our own interests. Too much affection for a foreign nation causes a country to imagine similar circumstances that do not exist, and too much hatred for a foreign nation causes a country to too easily take offense, and therefore to too easily be drawn into unnecessary war. We find ourselves in the most remarkable circumstances. Providence has made us the sole lords and proprietors of a vast tract of continent, one that provides us with all the soils of the earth and with many of its climates, which therefore might provide us with all the necessities of life and many of its conveniences. By way of our victory over Great Britain, we are generally now acknowledged to be in the complete possession of our own independence and liberty. And Providence has now crowned those previous blessings. By way of our American Constitution, and more recently our Bill of Rights, with a greater promise of political happiness than any nation has heretofore been offered. Why would we forego these advantages? To step away from our own native soils, to engage in foreign wars which are no concern of our own. The war in Europe betwixt the Republic of France and the crown heads of that place, it is an ancient feud. It is not an American concern. Let us not allow ourselves to grow embroiled in foreign entanglements. I dare not suppose that any of these words I have shared with you will long be remembered. If they occasionally come to mind, serve to protect our nation from false patriotism or the spirit and fury of party politics, or to leave us disengaged in foreign intrigues, then I, for one, will certainly be satisfied. Whether or not I have been guided by these maxims myself these last 8 years, I believe the public record will answer. But let me affirm to you all here and now that I've always at least considered myself guided by them. But I am also full aware of my own shortcomings. I imagine that I must have committed many errors. I beseech the Almighty to reduce whatever evils those errors may tend towards, and I hope that you, the people, that when you look upon them, that you will do so with indulgence, with the knowledge that any errors I may have committed have never been from a malignancy of my heart, but rather simply a want of talent equal to the zealousness of my patriotism. I look forward now to stepping away from the public stage and taking my place alongside you as a common citizen in a free and independent United States of America. I believe that we are all, from here forward, to be viewed as players on a most conspicuous of stages, one that seems destined by Providence for displays of human greatness and felicity. But to rely upon Providence alone, without exerting ourselves to the utmost, that will serve to do nothing more than tempt Providence. I do not doubt that our systems of government have their faults, but I assure you that no more perfect form of government could possibly have been created at this epoch, and I trust that Providence will endeavor to aid us in our cause, will not now desert us, having already carried us through numerous dangers and hazards. But we are reminded in Addison's play Cato that mortals cannot command success, but we can do something more important. We can be worthy of that success. Let us endeavor to prove ourselves worthy. I'm also full aware that most of you don't often have the occasion to bring your questions or concerns to the attention of the Chief Executive, and so it is with that in mind that I hoped I might make myself available to answer what questions or concerns regarding my intentions of stepping away from this office, or those remarks I have just made, or those matters of the past that have brought us to this point, or anything else, I suppose, of a public nature, to which I might provide answer. Have any of you questions or concerns I may address? No.
Yes, I understand your interest to get back to Mount Vernon to complete your project there. How long has it taken you to do your work there?
I'm asked how long has it taken to work at my home. I'm assuming you mean the farms, not just the house. Mount Vernon is a house.
Right.
But there's 6 farms just there on that property. which is only a small portion of the properties I own. But to answer your question, ma'am, I've owned that property since '55. So I've been engaged in it for what, 30, 40, 43 years now. Other questions, sir?
Why did you want to be president?
The question is, why did I want to be president? I didn't, ma'am. I've never wished this office for a number of reasons. Not the least is the fact that I suffer a deficiency of education. I do not doubt at all that other men could have served in this position better than myself. Secondly, is those properties in Fairfax. Just like the rest of you, my economy found itself in a great disadvantaged circumstance after the late war. And I had those matters that I had to attend to. Thirdly, I stated over and over again throughout the war, I served as General and Commander-in-Chief without salary. And I mentioned on multiple occasions that I were not seeking personal gain. How will I be remembered by posterity if after having so frequently said that, I then take the seat of government? Now, it was never my intention, and I never wished this position. I only agreed to stand for office because a number of men insisted that I had to for the survival of our new Constitution and our Union. In fact, I'd hoped to only serve temporarily. It wasn't even my intention to complete 4 years, a full term. So you may imagine my disappointment when I learned that the nation expected me to finish a term. It has been my practice ever since the second time I resigned my commission as a lieutenant colonel, back in the war where France was our enemy and England our friend, to make known a valedictory or farewell address. I wrote one 4 years ago. That's how strongly I intended to step away from this office 4 years ago. I say I wrote it. I believe I've also mentioned my deficiency of education. I commonly will have better educated men write these matters for me. And in that case, it was Mr. Madison. And a number of men come to me, not the least of which were my former Secretary of the Treasury and my former Secretary of the State. And those two men specifically, they very hardly argued against me that I must stay in the office, that I must stand for a second term, because otherwise our new burgeoning political parties would render this nation asunder. Words that are all the more disturbing because those two men are the heads of those political parties. But I will tell you, on this occasion, no amount of cajoling, debate, argument, oration will keep me in this office for a third term. So, the question is, how does one address the President of the United States? As Mr. Washington or Mr. President? There were some attempts to make it far more aristocratic than that, against my opinions.
Two questions. We'd like to know how you knew that readout 9 and 10 were so important for Yorktown. The second question is about, if public opinion is so important to the nation, what would happen to the nation if there was if people started believing lies and things that weren't true?
I'm asked two things. One is, how did I know the advantages of taking readouts 9 and 10 at Yorktown? And if you mean for the winning of the war, I didn't. If you mean for the taking of the works at Yorktown, well, it's common military knowledge, Mom. The redoubts in question were the very end of the flank, the enemy's left flank, and they were very close to our own line, close enough that we could take them by surprise. If you can capture a portion of your enemy's work, then you turn their work against you. And their defenses are not, I'm about to say they're not intended to be defended from within their work. There is actually some intention for that, because there is the knowledge that you may lose positions. But it is a great advantage. The main purpose of a defensive work is to defend from across it, not from within its own flank. So by taking it, we turned the enemy's line, made it impossible for them to defend their works, therefore causing them to capitulate. They could have continued. They could have fought on. But Lord Cornwallis proved himself an honorable man. He did the minimum of what was necessary to preserve his reputation. And what I mean by that is he attempted a sortie. He sent men out of his works to attempt to reclaim that position. And he made an attempt to escape, to cross over the York. Matters which failed, one, because of the weather, and two, because most of the vessels that he had available to him, he had already scuttled, and they were now unable to cross that river. And the reason those matters are important is because he has to show, before he surrenders, he of course was court-martialed, as is any commander who finds himself engaged in a failure. And those matters will prove and will end up saving his honor, to show that he hadn't simply surrendered, but he attempted every means possible to try to retake and hold his position. The other matter, isn't that the issue we're already in, ma'am? We have a number of newspapers. Most of them are sided with one or two of these fledgling parties. That's the real issue, ma'am. It's party politics, which should never have been introduced into our shores. And I'm thinking immediately of the Philadelphia Advertiser. I can't even say the name. Advertiser, which is paid for and supported by a former member of my administration. In fact, he was a member of my administration when we were paying for them. And most of the words of this gentleman come directly out of that man's mouth, or Mr. Madison's. I mentioned earlier that Madison wrote my previous valedictory address. I'm on the verge of having a new one printed. But it will not be by Mr. Madison, my former friend. I have required Mr. Hamilton to use portions of his words. But Mr. Hamilton's writing a new one. Here's the issue, ma'am. The difficulty is we have defended our rights and liberties to the First Amendment. And what I'm speaking of directly is the right of a free press. And unfortunately, that does mean that some men may abuse and misuse that press to their own advantage. But the freedom of the press, that is the bulwark on which all liberty rises. If we were to take actions to remove those rights and to limit those disagreeing words, then we will all be led like sheep to the slaughter. So what does one do? I subscribe to the Philadelphia Advertiser. I can promise you right now, once I'm out of this office, I will cancel that subscription. But at present, I subscribe to that. I subscribe to a number of newspapers, all up and down the eastern seaboard, as well as some foreign newspapers. I've surrounded myself my entire life with wise counselors. In fact, I mentioned earlier, the head of both of the political parties, well, to be honest, my former Secretary of the Treasury only led half of that party. There's a division between the Federalists, between the Adams Federalists and the Hamilton Federalists. But both Colonel Hamilton and Mr. Jefferson, the creator of our first political party, were both on that administration. That wasn't by some accident. What good does it do any man to surround himself with counselors who do nothing but agree or hold positions he already holds? Is that any advantage? No. Because that's how one remains uninformed and misled. The larger amount of information you can get, that's how you reach the truth. And that's why I subscribe to that lying newspaper. Well, I sort of just said it. I'm asked, where do these political parties come from? A member of my previous administration, my administration the first 4 years, decided that he disagreed with decisions of the administration that he was making. He spoke differently in public than he spoke in our meetings. And he reacted to the administration by creating a political party which is called either the Democratic or the Republican, or sometimes Democratic Republicans. In fact, he demanded that I stand for a second term, as I mentioned, stating that these political parties were threatening our nation. When I showed him my reluctance to do so, he stated that it was my duty, regardless of my personal situations and concerns, to remain in office. And then when I was re-inaugurated for a second term, what did Mr. Jefferson do? He immediately resigned. And when I spoke to him about his duty, he said, well, I have personal concerns that I have to attend to. Now, what happens when you create the one party to attack the administration is it causes the administration now to become the other party. And they borrowed a previous name, the name that were being used when we were arguing for the defense of the Constitution, that being the Federalists.
I understand Lafayette was on his staff. Did he actually fight in any battle?
Absolutely, ma'am. He wasn't on my staff. He was one of my general officers. There's a difference. I mentioned Colonel Hamilton, for instance, a moment ago. He was on my staff. The general staff is a body of aides, aide-de-camps, secretaries. When I mentioned counselors earlier, I meant some of those people, but more importantly, I meant other general officers. I had 35 general officers at various times throughout the war. And the gentleman you speak of was one of those. The Marquis de Lafayette was the Major General in command of my light infantry division, or eventually he was. The truth is, I just said he wasn't on the staff. When he first got there, in fact, he was on my staff because I didn't know what else to do with him. The Marquis Gilbert came here against his own king's permission. In fact, at threat of being in jail. His king told him not to come here. He did so anyway at his own expense. Apparently, not familiar with our geography, he landed in South Carolina and then made his way from there to Philadelphia, where he stood before the Congress and asked to be made an officer in our army. Now, let me familiarize you with what the circumstances were at the time. The very man that invited him to come here had invited far too many foreign officers to come here. We had been over-inundated with foreign officers who weren't interested in our cause, who could care less about the rights of man, but who were endeavoring to either fatten their pocketbooks or gain glory. And so when he came to the Congress, they were done with this. And they were unwilling to give him a commission. And he countered that by saying that he would serve in an officer's position the same way I were, without salary. In which case they made him a major general. Which leads to the difficulty that I had when he first arrived in Philadelphia, to where the army was in Philadelphia, which is that suddenly I have this young man, he was 19 years of age, at the time he hardly spoke our language. While he was nothing more than a captain in the French army, he was now a major general in ours, and they didn't send him with a division. A division I could have used. Another major general without a division was of very little use, particularly one that could not speak our language. I had no idea what to do with him. So yes, for a brief period of time, I did in fact make him an aide-de-camp, which was a risk, because aide-de-camps, as I think I alluded to a moment ago, are not major generals.
No.
In fact, they're usually majors or lieutenant colonels. He could have very easily taken offense at that position, but he never did. And in fact, I remember very clearly one of the first encounters I had with the gentleman. I was showing him our defensive works around Philadelphia, and I asked him what he thought about the placement of our guns. And his response was, "Your Excellency, I did not come here to teach you the practice of war. I came here to learn from you." No other foreign officer has ever said that to me. And later he proved his abilities. Your question was, did he ever fight? Besides being in command, it's the light infantry division that took the 9th Redoubt. But his first engagement was a Brandywine. He pled to let me give him the command of the flank. He assured me that he could hold that flank. And as little experience he had, and with no knowledge of his abilities myself, I was moved by his pleading, and I gave him the opportunity. And we lost at Brandywine, but we did not lose that flint. And he was wounded, in fact, at Brandywine in that action. Now, Virginia owes him a great debt. He was responsible for defending Virginia for several months in '81, just before we got here at Yorktown. For several months, it was only he and his light infantry division that was countering Lord Cornwallis at all. So he was engaged in quite a bit of great and heavy combat.
President Washington.
One moment. It depends on what you mean, sir. He wasn't there at the ceremony, but it was he that entered into the arrangement of surrender earlier when we met, he and I previously. Yes, I did.
I read about a battle where you got done with the battle and you had bullet holes in your coat, but not in your body.
No, the horses did, though.
The horses had them in their body. But
Yes.
Did that make you understand some sort of providential?
Well, it showed me that it wasn't my time to die, sir. I don't think the horses found it that providential, because those shots went right through my coat into the horse. I had 3, if you remember the rest of it, sir, there were also 3 horses shot underneath me.
And can you give any
Further comment on that subject?
Not on that, but there was this Black Robe Regiment about the veracity of the American colonies preachers that the King of England was like, they're terrible guys, but these preachers are just like patriots.
The gentleman wants me to tell you that all preachers were patriots. Were they?
No.
Do you know that we had 3 Virginian preachers arrested at Yorktown? Preachers were just like everyone else, sir. They were on both sides, just like all we were. I should also mention, because I think it's interesting, Thomas Price, one of those 3 ministers I just spoke of, was the very preacher that wrote the sermon that we're giving here in Virginia on the 1st of June, when the House of Burgesses entered into an agreement of, they entered into a day of fasting, humiliation, and prayer to show support for the people of Boston. And yet Thomas Price had run off as a loyalist for the support of Lord Cornwallis at York. In fact, he was arrested, as I mentioned. He and 2 other clergymen were arrested in that place. But this is interesting, and I think of note, because he clearly backed the wrong horse in that fight. But he was the minister of one of 2 parishes in Gloucester, and I'm trying to remember. It wasn't Ware. It was the other one. I'm not from Gloucester, but there's 2 parishes in the place, Ware and the one that he's from. And the one he was from, the people of that parish, they so missed their minister that they petitioned the governor to pardon him for his crime and allow him to return to his people. Yes. The shooting or the argument in general? They're 2 separate questions. The question is, how did our argument with Great Britain begin? Do anyone here recall when our argument with Great Britain began?
Taxation without representation.
I said when.
Oh, when?
When? What year? No. What was the gentleman spoke to the part of the issue, but what was actually the cause of that? What were they speaking of? What was the actual issue, the tax in question?
Wasn't it the stamp tax?
The stamp tax. With the stamp tax. Now, I say that as a Virginian. I don't know if we have any New Englanders here, but if you're a New Englander, you're going to say 63 and you're going to say the Sugar Act. But the Sugar Act never really affected us here in Virginia. But here in Virginia, it was the Stamp Act. In 65, so 10 years previous to the circumstance that you spoke of. That is very important, particularly as we stand here in the former capital of Virginia. Even before we learned the details of the Stamp Act, when we only had heard that a Stamp Act was being placed, a young gentleman, young then, he's just as elderly as I am now, was a new member of our House of Burgesses. It was, in fact, his very first session. And he stood up in that body, and he said in the House of Burgesses that Caesar had his Brutus, and that King Charles had his Cromwell, and that King George might well learn by their examples. Now, I should mention I wasn't there. I was a member of the House of Burgesses at that time, but the gentleman in question, Mr. Henry, he purposely waited till most of us had gone home, till he still had a quorum present, but that those that he thought were more conservative and might not support his cause, myself included, that we were gone. And then he overstepped his bounds and put a law on the table. He did do it through George Johnston, but still, and made a speech, which is not at all customary for a freshman member of the House of Burgesses. Now, what I'm not clear on, which is why I stated I was not there, is you asked about newspapers. I learned of this speech the same way you did, through the newspapers. And some of those newspapers say, well, they all agree that the members of the House called out that that was treason, which isn't exactly correct, it's sedition. And many of them are lawyers, they should know that. But Mr. Henry, according to one of the newspapers, said, if this is treason, make the most of it. And the other newspapers claimed that he said, perhaps I have spoken too far, I would defend the king with my last life's blood. You see why you need to read multiple sources? I have no idea which one of those he actually said. As I say, had left already. My home's 150 miles from here. I only mention any of this because the Stamp Act was repealed. It was only in effect for 6 months. But then it was followed by the Townsend duties. Taxes mostly on imported necessities, but on one imported luxury. Tea. And the Townsend duties were repealed after 2 years' time, all by legal action, all by us protesting, by refusing to purchase, by sending petitions, remonstrances, and memorials. But when the Townsend duties were left in effect, the one luxury tax on it was left in effect, probably to counter our main argument that the rest of these things were necessities. And things got quiet for a little bit. But then they passed the Tea Act itself, which gave the monopoly on the import of that product to one particular company. And that company was bringing its tea into 4 ports, and in one of those ports, that tea was destroyed. Now, here in Virginia, we certainly did not support the actions in Massachusetts. When you're crying out in defense of your rights to property, which is what taxation by consent is, how can you deny another man of his property and call yourself virtuous and just? But neither can you support the action by the administration of Westminster. The Parliament determined to close the port of Boston Harbor, to starve women and children for the crimes of what, maybe 2009? That was the reason for that day of fasting, humiliation, and prayer I mentioned on your question earlier, to show support for the law-abiding subjects of Boston. And of course, later shots were fired at Lexington and Concord, beginning the war. The reason I've answered, she's gone. No, I think she's right there.
Oh, she's right there.
The reason I answered the question the way I did is the gentleman I mentioned earlier, my former Secretary of the State. He was there. He did hear that speech by Mr. Henry. He wasn't a member of the House. He was only a college student in those days. But he later has said, and I think I'm correct in this, I don't always quote Mr. Jefferson, but I absolutely agree with him in this matter, that the revolution had ended before shots were fired at Lexington and Concord. And it began there in '65. I fear that there's no more time for this portion of my discussion. But I'm going to take myself in a moment up this hill into a small shaded area just next to Mr. Palmer's, that 2-story brick house across the way, and make myself available there for whatever further questions you may have and any quick sketches you may wish. God save us all. And God save our Constitution.
Well, that's a wrap for this Colonial Williamsburg video. I hope you really enjoyed it, getting to see another part of this amazing living history museum. If you like this sort of stuff, Check out my other videos. Check out colonialwilliamsburg.org to plan your own visit here because it's so much cooler in real life than it is on film. Till next time, this is History Buff, TN Photobug signing out, and I'm having a blast with the past.